Today's episode of I Love Black People on Howard University's Radio Voices on Sirius XM 141 is brought to you by the Global Green Book, a Black Survival Guide. The Global Green Book 2020, the Healthcare Edition, which identifies Black-friendly and Black-owned healthcare providers worldwide. A Black Survival Guide highlighting places across the globe for Black people. The Global Green Book, available on Amazon and iloveblackpeople.com.
All right, and welcome again to I Love Black People. I'm your host, Sinclair Skinner, where the global Black agenda meets revolutionary innovation. And we've been blessed to be joined by an amazing brother, a brother that's been so helpful and guiding me through so many places near and far. And I have to just be clear that I had to give a proper introduction. It was so proper. I said, look, I think I need you to say most of it yourself because, brother, it's so much you do and it's so significant to our lives as a people. I just want to welcome good brother Obi Igbuna to the show. And thank you so much, brother, for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Mr. Skinner.
Well, humbly. So today's conversation really centers around the work you've been doing with the Cuban doctors. And I did tell you that I would love for you to give a context for that conversation as it relates to some of the things you introduced me to, even my business partner in Zimbabwe and so many things that have been so helpful for the liberation of our people globally to the point where I'd be remiss just to limit your conversation to one topic. But I definitely want to give you open bandwidth to kind of give us context and get us going. So what you got, good brother?
Yes, well, of course, I'm always humbled to be around you and glad that we've worked together now around this work. It goes back to, my memory says 2007. So that's 14 years. So that's a good thing, always. So let's start. So today I'm wearing a couple of hats. I'm the first U.S. correspondent to the Herald, Zimbabwe's national newspaper, in the 41-year history of that country. That's significant for a couple of reasons. Those who know Zimbabwe's history know that after their independence, the apartheid apparatus in South Africa owned the newspaper, the Herald. So they had to generate the capital in order to purchase the paper. At the time, just coming to power, the resources weren't there. So it was the government of Nigeria who put up the money for them to purchase the newspaper. So ironically, as you would have it, me being a son of Nigeria, born in Nigeria, in a village called Ozobolo, in then Anambra State, I become 28 years later, the first U.S. correspondent in the history because I'm based in Washington, D.C. So there's a historical context there. Also the external relations officer of an organization called the Zimbabwe-Cuba Friendship Association. Because of the type of work we do, we're obligated by history to always talk about the positive attributes of the countries that we defend passionately and unapologetically and patriotically. So whenever you talk about Zimbabwe, you talk about the 97% literacy rate, which resonates with people who are doing affirmative action work, which resonates with people who are trying to save HBCUs and PBIs, which resonates with people who are dealing with African independent schools, which resonates with people inside U.S. borders who are genuinely concerned that 8,000 children drop out of school every single day. So from that vantage point, from 1986 to 1996, 3,000 Zimbabwean teachers, 6 years into their independence, were sent to Cuba for academic training. And they came back and they became the backbone and the staple of the educational system in Zimbabwe. So there's a connection there. And you wanted me to tackle the issue of the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act of 2001, which were the sanctions imposed on the people of Zimbabwe after they heroically reclaimed their indigenous land that had been out of their clutches since 1890. And even after independence in 1980, they patiently gave way to a diplomatic overture that between 1980 and 1990, $5 billion would be put up by the United States government and the British government, and the beneficiaries of colonialism of British and Rhodesian ancestry would transition off of that land. But on the United States side, Reagan immediately coming in, being true to his roots, being the spy for Hollywood during the McCarthy era, with his anti-communist leaning, um, attempting to destroy the Black Panther Party in California. And of course, as time went on, the assassination of Maurice Bishop in Grenada, the bombing of Libya in 1986, he let it be known that he was not going to broker an agreement and finalize what Jimmy Carter had started because he wasn't an original broker. So nothing happened on the U.S. side. Overtures were made by Margaret Thatcher, overtures were made by John Major, and then Tony Blair, who many people feel is a cheap carbon copy of Bill Clinton. He went for regime change. So once this happened, then we get to 1999, where you have something called Operation Sovereign Legitimacy, where Zimbabwe's military, Namibia's military, and Angola's military defend and prevent a reinvasion of the Congo, which was the project that was a coming out party for Susan Rice, former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, former national security advisor to President Barack Obama, whose PhD is on Zimbabwe, by the way. So what ends up happening is that while she's working for Madeleine Albright, this blows up in her face. So after the land reclamation program, the United States government imposes what's called the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act. And it was bipartisan. So while the Bush administration, General Colin Powell as the Secretary of State, pushed it through on the Republican side, Donald Payne of the Congressional Black Caucus pushes it through Congress with his partner Christopher Smith in New Jersey, and Senator Joseph Biden, who at the time was the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. So if people are surprised that he renewed these sanctions, you should not be surprised. When former President Obama was the lowest ranking member on that Foreign Relations Committee and wrote President Bush a letter in 2006 saying, don't lift the sanctions on Zimbabwe till the dark cloud of then President Robert Mugabe was ousted from power. But what they really meant was the ruling party, ZANU-PF. So Biden has wanted regime change in Zimbabwe for a very long time. Hillary Clinton wanted regime change in Zimbabwe. And to the surprise of some of you, a liberal Senate congressman at the time in 2001 named Bernie Sanders, he was on the congressional side of things at that time, he was in favor of those sanctions. And one of the heartbreaking things for us is the Congressional Black Caucus, not one of them voted against these sanctions. As a matter of fact, they came 5 votes short of voting unanimously in favor of the sanctions. And those who did not vote in favor abstained. Cynthia McKinney of Georgia abstained. Corin Brown of Florida abstained. Stephanie Tubbs Jones, now deceased, abstained. Carolyn Kilpatrick, the mother of former Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick in Michigan, Detroit, she abstained. And Bobby Rush, the second recruit of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party after Fred Hampton, the first recruit, he abstained. And at the time, we compared that to those Caucasians who used to hang around the lynching parties. They may not have poured tar on us. They may not have beat us unconscious. They may not have put the noose around our necks or hung us from the tree, but they were there the whole time. And their presence solidified and confirmed that what was going on had their absolute blessing. So in a nutshell, the Obama administration for 8 years renewed these sanctions. The Bush administration, when they introduced the sanctions in 2001, they maintained it. And the Trump administration maintained these sanctions. And now from the looks of things, the Biden administration will maintain these sanctions. And people may ask the question, well, what do sanctions do? They represent diplomatic terrorism in the hands of our former captors and colonizers. We know their preference is to bomb nations. We know their preference is to invade nations. We know their preference is to create coup d'etats in nations. Bombing countries for the U.S. government is just as common as cross burning was for the Ku Klux Klan in their heyday. But when they can't do it, they resort to sanctioning, the type of sanctioning that left 500,000 children in Iraq dead. And to quote President Obama himself during his first inauguration, he said, "The might of our military must be matched by the strength of our diplomacy." In code, while we'd prefer to bomb you, while we'd prefer to assassinate your leader, we'll starve you to death, child by child, woman by woman. man by man, if that's what the order of the day and if that's what the climate dictates.
There's a broader global picture, and I think you connecting that to the global Black agenda is what our conversations here are about. How do we take action locally by understanding what's going on globally?
From a humane point of view, from a political point of view, we think we can do a little bit of all. 10 years ago, I was with former President Mugabe of Zimbabwe, part of the press team when they come to the United Nations General Assembly. And there was a private meeting between the African heads of state, Mr. Skinner, and the World Health Organization. And there it was revealed that non-communicable diseases, NCDs, are now the number one killer of the human being on the planet Earth. So they were saying that from 2011 to 2038, they were projecting 57 million deaths. And for your listeners who don't know what NCDs are, diabetes, heart attacks, strokes, high blood pressure, cancer, which means they've surpassed HIV/AIDS, malaria, cholera, and some of these other diseases that have crippled the poor all over the world. So they felt obligated to talk to Africa exclusively because of the lack of infrastructural development in relationship to health. So the issue was, and so when you look at the corona pandemic based on the symptoms, it's synonymous. They were saying that when there are no parameters or territorial boundaries for these pandemics. And when they invade your territorial space, people with NCDs that have respiratory challenges, they're the most compromised. So when you look at that and you look at the fact that Cuba is the face fight to eradicate corona. First of all, since last year, they have developed 4 vaccinations. They are the only nation in Latin America that is a vaccine manufacturer. And before, they were using interferon alpha 2B, which they created in 1986 to deal with HIV/AIDS. But since then, they have created 4 vaccinations. One is called Sovereign 1, the other one is called Sovereign 2. The other one is called Abdallah, after a Jose Marti poem. And then there's another one named after a the highest ranking woman freedom fighter when they were dealing with the Spanish American War. And their corona rate in Cuba is so low that they had to send it to Iran for the clinical testing to be done. And the government of Venezuela and what's called the Bolivarian nations of the Americas, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Haiti, they've said that this will be their vaccination of choice. But because they have what's called the Henry Reeve Medical Brigade, and ironically, Henry Reeve is a Brooklyn, New Yorker of Caucasian persuasion who fought on Cuba's side during the Spanish-American War. And when we talk about Cuba, Mr. Skinner, we make the mistake sometimes of just talking about Comandante Fidel Castro's rise to power from the 50s, from 53 to 59, and then, of course, all the way up to his transition five years ago. But what we have to remember is that the first 7 presidents of the United States of America wanted to annex Cuba. Cuba could have ended up like Texas and California, formerly part of Mexico, snatched away, could have ended up like Puerto Rico, could have ended up like Guam, could have ended up like the U.S. Virgin Islands. But because this is a health issue, now bringing it back to the United States context, Booker T. Washington formed Negro Health Month. Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois had a sociological study called The Physique and Health of the Negro American, how people created in the same year that Plessy versus Ferguson took place in 1896, which is the same year we established the National Association of Colored Women, and Happy Women's Month to all our African warrior women out there. And Nannie Helen Burroughs, Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell, and Harriet Tubman were part of the same organization. Yes, they were. And so I wanted to mention that real quickly. And during that same year, we started the NMA, National Medical Association, because we couldn't join the American Medical Association because of segregation. So this fight to deal with corona, the fact that Cuba is the driving force behind it, and they've got 54 doctors in Italy, they've got doctors and medical personnel all over the world. The United States did not want them to come in. So we came up with an appeal in the tradition of David Walker's appeal, in the tradition of the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey's appeal to white America in 23, Du Bois' appeal to the United Nations in 47, and the appeal that Brother Malcolm was working on before the NYPD, FBI, and CIA had other ideas. So we were calling for their medics to be able to come here and work. their medics to be able to come here and train medics who are not used to functioning under a pandemic. And they would work, and we were calling for them to work in conjunction and be hosted by the National Medical Association and Black Nurses Association. And we have asked, and we had an appeal that had a broad range, as Mumia Abu Jamal is fighting for his life in Philadelphia tonight, as Russell Maroon Schultz, another one of our incarcerated freedom fighters, is fighting for his life tonight. Both of them supported our campaign. Crucial because Nkrumah was the first leader in the world to recognize the Cuban Revolution. So we're talking about this in that context, and we are calling on one of your distinguished Howard alum, Mayor Raz Baraka of Newark, New Jersey, who promised us last summer that he would write a letter to the African American Mayoral Association, to the National Conference of Black Mayors, and the World Conference of Mayors, that all of our mayors that look like us should support the push for Cuban medical personnel to come inside United States borders. But of course, because we are children of Africa, and we always try to honor by practice the last line of Lift Every Voice and Sing, which they don't let us sing, with Cuba being the face of medical transformation on the African continent, not just because of their ability to treat people, but in addition to that, in closing, they train the children that want to be doctors of the countries in Africa so that they can stay in their countries and we can reverse the brain drain. And then, of course, this also is in harmony with the last year was the 20th anniversary of a pact between Cuba's government and the Congressional Black Caucus, that 500 young people a year could go to the Latin American School of Medical Sciences and come back to the poorest parts of the United States and be doctors to our people. So in a language that people are more accustomed to, since you accept the amputated narrative of the African experience, more Charles Drews for you, more Daniel Hale Williams for you, more Ernest Everett Just for you, more people out of Meharry College for you, but they could go to Cuba for that final phase of training. So that's what the Get Out of Cuba Way campaign is about. It's fighting for Cuban medical personnel to have access to United States borders, something we weren't aggressive enough about when they wanted to come to the Gulf region during Hurricane Katrina, and we focus more on Kanye West stating the obvious about how George Bush feels about African people. We always make the irrelevant relevant. That's what, when you accept the narrative of victimization, you do that type of thing. But in the spirit of correcting mistakes, we can fight for the Cuban medical personnel to come to the United States. And at the same time, at a moment in history where there's 784 million people on the planet that live on $1.90 a day, and 400 million of them live in our mother continent, of the 25 poorest nations in the world, 22 of them are on our mother continent. This is the time to empower their work on the African continent while we're fighting for them in the diaspora, something that's truly Pan-Africanist in scope and content, because people think that Pan-Africanism means dealing with the African continent exclusively. That makes no sense at all, and it's not historically accurate. As a matter of fact, the term Pan-Africanism was first used in Trinidad by Henry Sylvester Williams. So we just want to make sure that our work takes on that character. And last week we had a concert saluting the Cubans. We had artists in Norway, artists in Nigeria, artists in Ghana, artists in South Africa, artists in Belize, and we did a concert in July. So in 2 concerts, we've had artists from 10 African nations, 8 Caribbean nations, the extension of Africa, 17 US cities, 4 UK countries, including Canada, step up to the plate. So that's what we were here to talk about. And it's once again a push through the Zimbabwe-Cuba Friendship Association. And of course, the oldest form of imperialist sanctioning is on Cuba. So just like Zimbabwe has been sanctioned for 20 years, the same way that Eritrea was sanctioned for 10 years, and the same way our sisters and brothers in Venezuela are being sanctioned today, Cuba has been blockaded, the most extreme form of sanctioning, since 1962. And that has cost them nearly $200 billion, which would go towards the free health care that they give all their citizens, the free education they give all their citizens. So the objective of this type of sanctioning is to crush your economy, crush your social infrastructure, and crush your patriotic spirit. But it is nations like Cuba and Zimbabwe and Eritrea and Venezuela who have earned the right. For the next 2 months, this is what we're going to do. with your help, of course, because we've hung out in these places before. We're going to sit down with the diplomats in DC that represent the Southern African Development Community. Those are the Southern African nations for your listeners who might not know what we're talking about. Then we're going to sit down with the West African diplomats. We're going to sit down with the Eastern African diplomats, and we're going to smile at them and humbly say, all we want from you by African Liberation Day, which is May 25th, are memorandums of understanding clearing the way for us to be able to provide this technical support for the Cuban medical personnel in their different countries. In a discussion with the Cuban diplomats last week, they've agreed to give us a list of all the places in Africa where they are present. And then through that process, we will engage the Ministry of Health. What do you need in Eritrea? What do you need in Ethiopia? What do you need in Liberia? What do you need in Guinea? And then we can strategically start with the countries that our people love to go to. Africans are now going to Ghana, for example, like gamblers go to Las Vegas and Atlantic City. So we can ensure that every time they go to Ghana, they take something for the Cuban medical personnel, be it syringes, be it stethoscopes, be it telescopes, be it an x-ray machine. And we get the clearance of the diplomats at the regional level so they don't get in the way of the process. And there shouldn't be much of a backlash, but even if there is, we're prepared for it because we know that we're doing what is morally upright, as Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso used to tell us.
Well, I think the point you did, again, those call to actions, where again, I'm sure there's listeners who have relationships and deal with maybe even some of the embassies and do their own works are involved in some of the diplomacy or governmental relationships. And I think it'd be helpful if folks, are now aware that there is a movement in during a pandemic where we're trying to find ways not to for people to take financial advantage, but literally take a medical advantage, a medical advantage that will give us an advantage that may not have been able to be seen or as important or relevant until the pandemic, but literally having a strategy that can impact people all over. I think even the part with the tourism part of making sure that we're not just tourists. I mean, again, looking at Frantz Fanon talking about Africans being in other parts of the world, what they are, and being a tourist, we got to send them back home. And if you're going home, take some stethoscopes with you and actually give yourself a purpose beyond the personal, something that deals with the collective. I think it's awesome.
I'm glad that you brought that up, Mr. Skinner, because before we end, I wanted to say something else. One of the things that offends the Cubans very much is when the United States and other imperialist nations call what they're doing medical diplomacy. And the reason that they want those of us to address that in a solidarity oriented capacity is it suggests that they only are willing to go to countries that are compatible with them ideologically. So you have to be revolutionary and you have to be socialist to receive their help. Italy, the homeland of Mussolini, is a beneficiary of 54 Cuban medics. They tell a story nearly 20 years ago of the first lady in Honduras at the time was in Cuba signing a memorandum of understanding for 700 Cuban doctors to be deployed to Honduras. At the same exact moment she was signing that diplomatic overture, her husband, the president of Honduras at the time, was with the United States in Geneva pushing through a resolution attacking Cuba for human rights violations. And under no circumstances did they say because of that they weren't going to release their doctors there. So time and time again, they've gone to countries that are not compatible with them in thinking. As a matter of fact, the predominantly neo-colonialist governments who are neither revolutionary and are neither socialist welcome them with open arms. So every day they're treating people in countries who are diametrically opposed to their economic principles, their political principles, and their human principles. So anytime that the United States, will be on the Democratic side of things or the Republican side of things, accuse them of medical diplomacy, they're blowing smoke.
What are the barriers? Are there any specific barriers to that? Is it who makes that
It's
call? How does that happen?
that's Senate, that's the Senate, that's the Congress, that's the White House. But with the appropriate pressure, so we get all the mayors on board. If we when we did the appeal, we were pleased. The council at large And PG County, understanding our relationship to PG County politically, my college classmate, the Honorable Calvin Hawkins, he signed on in support of it. We have a tendency to focus exclusively on the Congressional Black Caucus, and we forget we have another organization called the National Conference of Black State Legislators. And the Honorable Malika Sanders Fortier of the 23rd District in Alabama, one of the poorest districts in this country. But Cuba and Alabama have a very unique history.
If a
Okay,
baseball player can come from Cuba
I
under
understand.
some type of thing,
Right.
why
Okay.
couldn't there be an exchange of education or information
Okay.
through some other humanitarian? I
Now I see
apologize.
what you're saying. So
Yes.
the mechanisms and vehicles that we have to deal with are the Congressional International Relations Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And so those are the people, specific people. We would target Karen Bass, since she's the highest ranking Democrat on the Congressional International Relations Committees. But that doesn't mean that we should target those vehicles exclusively. Strategically, that means penetrating every circle available to us. That's the only reason I incorporated the others. But specifically, we would be aiming at the Foreign Relations Committee of the U.S. Senate and the International Relations Committee of the U.S. Congress, and identifying the Congressional Black Caucus members who focus on that area, and identifying who would be able to deal with the Senate and what have you. And we can have upfront engagement, we can have upfront lobbying, but what we've been doing since last year is we've taken a multifaceted approach. So the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco, which is the equivalent to councilwomen and councilmen, they passed a resolution. Um, Councilman Calvin Hawkins of PG County, he's on board. That's why I mentioned the others. So there's a strategy of how we approach city councils. There's a strategy of how we approach legislators. There's a strategy for dealing with mayors, and there's a strategy for dealing with the U.S. Senate and the U.S. Congress. I hope that answered that.
No, thank you. And again, thank you. So I think there's so much information you gave in a short period of time. And again, it just shows your body of work. It, precedes you, and definitely I know will follow you into the future for the sake of all our prodigy and children. Again, brother Obi, I'm just thankful and appreciate you coming on, being one of my first early guests, and definitely want to continue to have a platform where we can literally engage the global Black agenda in revolutionary, innovative ways. As much innovation that you've been, you are the revolution, you are the innovation, and I am because we are. Thank you, good brother.
Today's episode of I Love Black People on Howard University's Radio Voices on Sirius XM 141 is brought to you by the Global Green Book, a Black Survival Guide. The Global Green Book 2020, the Healthcare Edition, which identifies Black-friendly and Black-owned